There was a sense of peace in the small town that lay on the edge of the city. The streets were quiet, the houses lined up neatly on both sides of the road, with lawns trimmed and gardens blooming with color. It was the kind of place where people knew each other by name and the everyday sounds of life. Birds chirping, children playing, the soft hum of lawnmowers created a steady rhythm. It was a place where for most life felt predictable and safe. But for one man, this new home was a fresh start after a long, challenging journey. He had always wanted a place to call his own. A home where he could hang up his boots after a long day of work. A place where the memories of his past wouldn't chase him. The past had been a mix of pain and pride, as he had spent years in the military, serving his country with honor and discipline. As a former Marine, he had seen things most people could never imagine. He had been through battles, both physical and mental, and had learned to keep his emotions buried beneath the weight of his uniform. But now the uniform was gone, and in its place he had built something that belonged entirely to him, a house in a neighborhood that felt peaceful and away from the chaos he once knew. The man had moved here not long ago, hoping to finally leave behind the ghosts of war and start anew. His house was modest but comfortable, with a small front yard that he took pride in keeping neat. He spent his days working at a local shop, doing whatever he could to pay the bills and slowly fix up the house that was still a work in progress. The walls, though patched and the floors a little worn, gave him a sense of security. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. It wasn't the kind of place that would attract attention, and that was fine with him. He liked blending in, staying under the radar. The people in the neighborhood were mostly friendly, nodding when they passed by, exchanging pleasantries when they crossed paths. There was a sense of unspoken respect in the air, something he appreciated after years of serving under strict military rules. He wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he had been doing everything to avoid it. He didn't tell anyone about his past, preferring to let people think of him as just another man trying to get by. He never wore his old Marine Corps jacket or any of the other symbols that could give him away. He just kept to himself, doing his best to avoid drawing attention. But sometimes trouble finds you, even when you're doing your best to avoid it. It started off small at first, a few strange looks from some of the neighbors, a couple of whispers behind his back. He could feel their eyes on him whenever he stepped out of his house, but he brushed it off. Not everyone understood his background, and he wasn't interested in explaining. After all, he had a life to live, and his past was just that, his past. The first real sign that something wasn't right came when he noticed the marks on his fence. At first, they seemed like nothing, just a few scratches or perhaps the work of an animal. But the next morning, the same marks were there, only this time they were deeper. And then, in bright red spray paint, a word appeared on the side of his house. It was crude, offensive, a racial slur that made his stomach tighten with anger. He stared at it for a long time, the bright color standing out against the white paint of the house. He knew what it meant. He'd seen it before, though not in a long time. It was a symbol of hate, of people who couldn't stand the idea of someone like him living in their space. But he didn't let it get to him. He wiped the paint off quickly, pretending it was just a prank. He couldn't afford to lose his temper. He had to keep his cool. The next few days were filled with quiet tension. He worked on the house during the day, and at night, he stayed inside, keeping the windows closed, the blinds drawn. He didn't want to give anyone a reason to think he was bothered. But the unease was building inside of him, tightening like a knot in his chest. He had been through enough in his life to recognize when things were about to get worse, and sure enough, things did escalate. It was late one night when it happened again. He was sitting in his living room reading a book and sipping his coffee, when he heard a loud crash. The sound came from the backyard. His heart skipped a beat as he shot to his feet, knowing exactly what it was. Someone was messing with his property again. He moved swiftly to the back door, peering through the window. The shadows were long, but he could make out figures moving along the fence. They weren't even trying to hide. In fact, they were laughing as they smashed his garden gnome and threw his tools onto the lawn. His fists clenched. His Marine training kicked in. But he didn't act right away. No, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. He stood there in the darkness, watching them, silently calculating his next move. He wasn't going to let them ruin his life. The men were still laughing when he opened the door, but the laughter stopped when they saw him standing there, his figure framed in the doorway like a shadow. They hadn't expected him to be so calm. Most people would have been angry, shouting, demanding they leave. But he wasn't like most people. He had learned to stay calm in the face of chaos. And that's what scared them the most. Without a word, the gang scattered, retreating into the night. He could hear their footsteps fading, but he didn't move right away. He just stood there feeling a cold sense of unease wash over him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, he found his car had been keyed, deep scratches running down the side. It was clear they were sending a message, but he wasn't sure what that message was just yet. Maybe it was about him being new in town, about him not fitting in. Or maybe it was about something deeper, something more personal. But he was no stranger to being underestimated. He had been through worse, much worse, in his years as a Marine. He'd faced down enemies far more dangerous than this. He could handle this. It was just a matter of when. And as the days went by, he braced himself for what was coming next. He knew this wasn't going to be the end of it. No, something told him that the worst was still to come, and when it did, he would be ready. The following week, the man felt the tension in the air, thick like a storm that was about to break. He had tried to put it all behind him, to focus on his work and the little improvements he was making to his home. But the small incidents, the little signs kept gnawing at him. He couldn't escape them. Every time he stepped outside, his eyes would immediately scan the yard, the house, looking for something, anything that seemed out of place. He began to notice it more. The cold stares from some of the neighbors as he walked down the street. The whispers that seemed to stop whenever he got close. It was clear he wasn't entirely welcome, but that was something he was used to. His time in the military had taught him how to ignore the small slights, how to block out the noise and keep moving forward. The next incident took him by surprise. It was a Saturday morning. The sun shining bright and the birds chirping. He was in the middle of fixing a leaky pipe in the kitchen when he heard a loud thud from outside. It sounded like something had hit the side of the house. He paused, setting down his wrench and walking over to the window. His heart sank when he saw it, another message. This time it wasn't just a slur painted on his wall. It was worse. The gang had thrown something heavy at his front door, breaking the glass and shattering it into a million tiny pieces. There, sprawled out on the broken doorframe, was a note, a crude, handwritten message that made his blood boil. It wasn't just an attack on his home, it was personal. Leave now or you'll regret it. He stood there for a moment, his hands balled into fists. The rage he felt was bubbling up inside, but he kept it in check. He couldn't let them see how much it hurt. He knew that responding with anger wouldn't help. It would only give them what they wanted, a reason to push him even further. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with people like this was to stay calm, to stay in control. But this time it was different. This time they had crossed a line. He called the police, but the response was slow, as it always was. The officer on the phone told him they would send someone over, but it could take a few hours. That wasn't good enough. The man knew that by the time the police showed up, the gang would be long gone, and his property would be further damaged. He walked outside, looking over the damage. His front door was a mess, the glass scattered across the porch. He knew he needed to fix it, to clean it up. But the thought of doing that alone made the weight of it all hit him even harder. It wasn't just the house they were attacking. It was him. It was his life. And that made it feel so much worse. He spent the rest of the day fixing the door, replacing the broken glass, and trying to keep his mind focused on the task. He worked in silence, but his thoughts were loud, racing through his mind. What did they want from him? Why was he being targeted? Was it because of his race, because he didn't fit in with the rest of the neighborhood? That night, he sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. He didn't feel like watching anything. He couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. It was like he was a target, and no matter where he went or what he did, they would always find a way to hurt him. As the hours passed, he began to feel the weight of the situation. He was alone in this. He had no family nearby, no close friends to lean on. The Marines had taught him how to rely on himself, but that didn't mean he was immune to the isolation that came with being constantly under attack. He thought back to his time in the service, to the brotherhood he had shared with the men and women he fought alongside. But now it was just him, standing in a house that had become a symbol of his struggle. But even in the quiet of his thoughts, he knew he couldn't give in. He couldn't let them win. The next day, the man decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't sit around waiting for things to get worse. He needed to be proactive, to defend what was his before it was taken from him. He knew the gang wasn't just going to leave him alone. They were likely watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But this time he wasn't going to be caught off guard. He spent the entire day working on his house, putting up a new security system and reinforcing the doors and windows. He installed cameras, hoping that if they did try something again, he would have proof of who they were. That night he sat in his living room, watching the monitor that showed the outside of his house. It was late and the neighborhood was quiet. He kept the lights dimmed, the curtains drawn so that no one would know he was watching. His Marine instincts kicked in, and he felt the familiar tension in his muscles, the sharp awareness of everything around him. Around midnight, he saw movement. Figures were sneaking around his property, staying low to the ground, their faces hidden by hoods. They were the same people who had been harassing him. He could tell by their movements. They were back. He didn't panic. Instead, he quietly got up from his chair, moving toward the door. He had been prepared for this. He grabbed his tools, silently preparing to confront them, but not in the way they expected. He wasn't going to go out there guns blazing. No, he was going to make them regret ever coming to his house. He stepped outside quietly, taking a position behind a large bush near the driveway. The gang members were getting closer, their voices low, laughing as they moved. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He was the hunter now, and they were the ones who would be caught off guard. They walked right into his trap. As they got closer, he sprang into action. With quick, precise movements, he took down one of them, knocking him to the ground without making a sound. The others froze, startled by the sudden move. They hadn't expected him to fight back. But they quickly recovered, moving to surround him, but they didn't know who they were up against. The man, with his years of military training, made short work of them. He moved with the precision and speed that only a trained Marine could. One by one, the gang members were knocked to the ground, unable to fight back. They were scared, desperate, but they couldn't match his skill. In less than a minute, the gang was on the ground, groaning in pain. The man stood over them, breathing heavily, his heart still racing from the adrenaline. But there was no joy in his victory. He wasn't proud of what he'd done, but he knew it had to be done. As the police arrived shortly after, the gang members were hauled away, but the man didn't feel any relief. The damage had been done. His house had been destroyed, his peace shattered. And yet deep down he knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The days following the confrontation felt like a blur. The man had done what he needed to do, but it didn't bring him the peace he had hoped for. The chaos, the destruction still lingered. His house had been damaged, his peace shattered, and though the gang had been taken away, it felt like the battle wasn't over. The man had known for a long time that things never just ended. There was always something more waiting around the corner, something more to overcome. He tried to return to his routine, hoping that life would eventually settle back into its old rhythm. But the truth was, things had changed. The small town that had once felt like a safe haven now felt like a trap, a place where every shadow held a threat. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his house. It was about something deeper, something personal. The gang, though arrested, had left a mark on him that couldn't be erased so easily. They had made him feel vulnerable, something he hadn't felt in years. In the military, he had been part of something bigger than himself. There, he had learned how to fight for survival, how to defend himself and others when everything seemed to fall apart. But now it was just him alone in this battle. He had no backup, no comrades to lean on. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of their presence hanging in the air. He knew they had been watching him, waiting for their moment to strike again. It wasn't just about his house or the damage they had caused, it was about control. They wanted to make him feel small, insignificant, and powerless. The man found himself getting up earlier each day, working longer hours just to keep his mind busy. He started walking around the neighborhood more, taking different routes home, trying to shake off the constant feeling of being watched. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the unease gnawed at him like a constant itch he couldn't scratch. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. As he stepped outside, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. It was a car, sitting across the street, parked at an odd angle. It wasn't anything special, just an old sedan. But the way it was parked, the way it sat there with the engine running, sent a chill down his spine. He stopped in his tracks, his hand resting on the door frame, his eyes locked on the car. His instincts kicked in. Something was off. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he wasn't imagining it. The car stayed there unmoving, the engine hums filling the silence of the street. The man stood there for a moment, weighing his options. He could just ignore it, go on with his day, pretend like everything was normal, or he could take action. He chose action. The man slowly closed the door behind him, walking with careful steps toward the street. As he got closer, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, hunched over, their face hidden by the shadows of the car. The figure didn't seem to notice him, and for a moment the man considered turning back. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He stopped a few feet away from the car, just out of sight from the driver. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of what he should do next. Should he confront the person? Should he call the police? But something told him that calling the police wouldn't do any good. Not this time. He decided to approach the car, his footsteps light and measured. He couldn't afford to make a noise to alert whoever was inside. When he was close enough, he tapped lightly on the window. The figure inside jumped, startled, and the car door swung open. The man took a step back, his body tense, ready for anything. The driver was a young man, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked out of place, nervous, fidgeting like someone caught in the act. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice steady, but with an edge of authority. The young man hesitated, glancing at the man before looking back at the steering wheel. He didn't say anything at first. Then finally he mumbled, "Just passing through." The response was too quick, too rehearsed. The man didn't believe him. "Who are you, really?" he pressed, his voice getting sharper. "You've been watching my house, haven't you?" The young man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. He stammered for a moment, trying to come up with an excuse, but there was no use. The man could tell he was lying. Before the young man could say anything else, the man moved to the car and leaned in closer, his face just inches from the driver's. "You're part of the gang, aren't you?" The young man's eyes widened and he seemed to shrink back in his seat. For a moment there was silence. Then, almost in a whisper, the driver said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The man stared at him for a moment longer, his gaze unwavering. He had no time for lies. The young man was clearly involved with the group that had been terrorizing the neighborhood, and the man wasn't going to let them get away with it. "Get out of the car," the man ordered. The young man hesitated again, but eventually he opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. His hands were shaking and he couldn't seem to make eye contact. The man could see the fear in his eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said calmly, his voice softer now, though the anger still simmered beneath the surface. "But you need to leave. You need to tell your friends that I'm not someone they can mess with. I'm not afraid of them." The young man opened his mouth to say something, but the man cut him off. "Go, before things get worse for you." The driver didn't say another word. He just got back into the car and drove off, his tires squealing as he quickly turned down the street and disappeared. The man stood there for a long moment, watching the car vanish from sight. His pulse was still racing, but the tension had eased. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a while he felt like he had taken control. He had made a statement. He wasn't just going to let them terrorize him anymore. He wasn't going to sit back and let them destroy his life. The man knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. But for the first time, he felt like he had taken a stand. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He wasn't going to let them break him. No, this time it was his turn to fight back. And he was ready. The days following the incident with the young man were filled with a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The man had thought that confronting the driver would bring a sense of closure, but instead, it only left him feeling more unsettled. He knew it wasn't over. He had only scared one person away, but the rest of the gang, whoever they were still out there. They wouldn't just give up because he had stood up to them. In fact, it was likely they would come after him harder now, seeing him as a threat. The man couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, something that would force him to take action again. He couldn't sleep that night, his mind racing with the possibilities. He thought about his time in the military, the way he had learned to anticipate danger, to stay one step ahead of the enemy. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his home, the one place he thought he could finally find peace. By the time morning arrived, he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to wait for the next attack to come to him. He needed to take control of the situation, to show the gang that he wasn't someone they could just push around. He wasn't afraid of them. Not anymore. The first thing he did was check his security system. It was simple but effective. The cameras were in place, the locks on the doors and windows were reinforced, and the motion detectors were set. He had been careful, making sure that if anyone tried to come close, he would know about it. But as he scanned the monitors, he realized that the system was only as good as the person watching it. If he wasn't paying attention, the cameras wouldn't do much good. So he made a decision. He would stay alert, keep watch over his property. If the gang came back, he would be ready. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the man decided to go for a walk. He needed to clear his head to get out of the house and breathe for a while. He walked slowly, taking in the sights and sounds of the neighborhood. The quiet hum of traffic in the distance, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional bark of a dog. All of it felt normal, peaceful. And yet something felt off. There was a weight in the air, a sense of tension that hung around him like an invisible cloud. He kept his eyes moving, scanning his surroundings for anything out of the ordinary. As he walked, he passed a few familiar faces. Neighbors who waved, people he had seen a handful of times. Most of them seemed friendly enough, but there was a coldness in the air that made him uneasy. He could feel their eyes on him as he passed by, and it made his stomach twist. He didn't know if it was because of the incident with the gang or something else, but it didn't matter. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't welcome here. After a few blocks, he turned down a side street and found himself walking toward the park. The park had always been a place of peace for him, a place where he could clear his head. But today it felt different. The benches that lined the path seemed empty. The playground where children usually played was eerily quiet. There was a strange stillness in the air that set his nerves on edge. He sat on one of the benches, his eyes scanning the park. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but his instincts told him something was wrong. The world around him seemed to slow down, as if everything was holding its breath. That's when he saw them. A group of figures standing in the shadows near the tree line. At first he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them clearly. There were 4 of them, wearing dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods and hats. They were standing still, as if waiting for something. The man's heart rate picked up. His instincts told him these were the same people who had been tormenting him, the same gang that had been causing him so much trouble. He couldn't see their faces, but there was no mistaking the way they moved, the way they lingered just out of sight. They were watching him. He didn't move at first, but he knew that he couldn't stay here much longer. He had to act. He stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention to himself. His hand went to the pocket of his jacket, where he kept a small flashlight. He wasn't carrying a weapon, but he knew how to handle himself in a confrontation. The military had taught him that. He started walking away, but he kept his eyes on the figures in the distance. He could feel them following him, their gaze heavy on his back. His steps quickened, and as he reached the end of the park, he heard them moving behind him. The man didn't look back, but his mind was already calculating his next move. He had to get to his house to safety. He couldn't let them get too close. He knew that if they cornered him, it would be over. He took a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to lose them. But they were following, moving faster now. He could hear their footsteps behind him, the rustle of leaves under their feet. His pulse was pounding in his ears, but he kept moving, staying focused. He had to make it home. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw his house up ahead, the familiar sight of the front yard and the porch lights flickering in the distance. He felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. The figures were still behind him, getting closer. He reached the front door, his hand shaking as he fumbled for his keys. The noise of their footsteps grew louder, and then, just as his fingers brushed the keys, he heard a voice. "You don't belong here." The man froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, his back against the door. Standing there just a few feet away was one of the figures from the park. The man couldn't see their face clearly, but the voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had threatened him before. The man didn't speak. He knew there was nothing to say. This was it. The confrontation he had been dreading had finally arrived. The figure stepped closer, and then the others appeared, emerging from the shadows. There were 4 of them now, all standing in front of him, blocking his way. "You should have left when you had the chance," one of them said, their voice low and threatening. But the man didn't back down. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him any longer. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the figure closest to him. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not leaving. This is my home." The figures exchanged glances, and for a moment it seemed like they might back off, but then the one in front of him stepped forward, his hands balling into fists. "This isn't over," the figure said, and with that, they lunged at him. The man was ready. With quick reflexes, he dodged the first strike, using the figure's momentum to send them stumbling past him. He wasn't looking to hurt anyone, but he wasn't going to let them attack him either. He fought back with precision, using his military training to disable the first attacker, knocking them to the ground with a swift move. But the others weren't far behind. The fight had begun. The struggle in front of his house was everything the man had feared and hoped for. Every muscle in his body was tense, and his mind was running through every move he'd ever learned in the military. This wasn't a battle he wanted, but it was one that had been forced on him. The gang members who had tormented him for weeks had made one last attempt to take control. But this time he wouldn't back down. He wasn't going to let them win. The first man lunged at him, throwing a punch that the man easily dodged. His training kicked in instinctively. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted, sending him sprawling onto the ground. But before he could even think about taking a breath, another figure rushed at him from behind. Grabbing his shoulder in an attempt to shove him to the ground, he reacted immediately, spinning around and throwing the second attacker off balance. The man landed on the pavement with a grunt, but he wasn't out of the fight yet. The others closed in, and the situation went from bad to worse. There were too many of them, and though the man had the advantage of training, they had the numbers. But he was prepared. The anger that had been building inside of him for weeks, the frustration from the constant harassment, all of it pushed him forward. He wasn't going to let this be the end. He wasn't going to let them take what little peace he had left. He fought back with precision, using the environment to his advantage. He used the porch railing to launch himself higher, throwing one attacker off balance and forcing them to stumble into a nearby bush. He kicked out at another, knocking their legs out from under them. For a moment it felt like the tide was turning in his favor. But just when he thought he might have them, one of the figures reached into their jacket, pulling out something shiny. The man's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. A knife. He hadn't been prepared for that. His mind raced. He had to be careful. The last thing he needed was to end up in a life-threatening situation. The figure lunged forward, swinging the knife in a wide arc. The man barely had time to react, ducking to avoid the blade. He spun around, using his shoulder to knock the knife-wielding figure to the ground. But that was when he realized something. They weren't just trying to hurt him. They were trying to break him. With the group in disarray, the man saw his chance. He needed to end this before anyone else got hurt. He wasn't going to make the same mistake as before, letting them drag this out longer than it needed to be. With quick, decisive movements, he took down the last of the attackers, forcing them to the ground in a way that left them unable to move. For a moment, all he could hear was his own breath, heavy and ragged. His chest burned and his body felt like it was on fire. But it was over. The gang members, all of them now on the ground, groaned in pain, their faces twisted in shock. None of them had expected him to fight back like this, to have the skills to take them all on. They were the ones who had thought they could break him, and now they were the ones who were broken. The man didn't look down at them. Not yet. Instead, he stood there for a moment, catching his breath, his heart still racing. He wasn't proud of what had happened. He wasn't even sure what he felt. He just knew that it had to be done. That's when he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were on their way. He didn't wait around for them to arrive. He knew what had to come next. He walked inside his house, locking the door behind him and turning the deadbolt. He moved quickly, setting about cleaning up the mess outside, making sure there was nothing left that could tie him to the scene. He didn't want any more trouble than he already had. The police were going to come, and there was no telling how this would all play out. He wasn't sure what to expect when the authorities arrived, but he wasn't about to make it easy for them. Minutes later, the flashing lights of the police cruisers lit up the street outside. He could hear the officers talking to the gang members, trying to piece together what had happened. The man stood at the window, his eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, but it felt like hours. Finally, an officer knocked on his door. The man hesitated for a moment before walking over and unlocking it. The officer was tall, his expression stern but calm. He looked the man up and down as if trying to size him up. The officer didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just gestured to the scene outside. "Are you all right?" the officer asked, his voice steady. The man nodded. "I'm fine. They came after me." The officer didn't seem surprised by the answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes scanning the man's face. "You fought them off. We saw the footage from the cameras. You handled yourself well." The man didn't say anything. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't looking for anything, really. He just wanted this to be over. "We're going to take them in," the officer continued, his voice softer now. "But you should know that this is far from over. The gang has been causing trouble around here for a while, but you might be making things worse for yourself by getting involved. They might come after you again." The man didn't respond right away. He had heard enough. He knew what the officer was trying to tell him, but it didn't matter. He had already made his choice. "I'm not going anywhere," the man said, his voice firm. "They're not going to scare me away." The officer nodded as if he understood. "All right, but stay careful, and keep in touch with us if anything else happens." "We'll do what we can." The man didn't say anything else. He just closed the door behind him, locking it once again. He walked over to the couch and sat down, his body finally starting to relax. It was over for now, but he knew deep down that this wouldn't be the last time. The gang had shown him how far they were willing to go, and he had shown them that he wouldn't back down. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control. He had stood his ground. He had fought for his home, for his peace, and that was something he could hold on to.